Hello, I'm Fred Kowal, president of United University Professions, and this is The Voice.
I am a voice. I am a union. I am a sound of 100,000 workers strong. I am a voice. I am a clarion call. We are united. There ain't no one who can make us fall. I am a voice.
The Voice podcast is a production of United University Professions, the nation's largest higher education union, representing more than 42,000 academic and professional faculty and retirees at state-operated SUNY campuses across New York State. UUP also represents employees at SUNY System Administration and SUNY Public Teaching Hospitals in Brooklyn, Stony Brook, and Syracuse. I'm Mike Lisi.
Our guest today is National Wildlife Federation President and CEO Collin O'Mara. Before becoming the CEO and president of NWF in 2014, Collin made a name for himself in his hometown of Syracuse. Collin graduated from West Genesee High School and earned his master's in public administration from Syracuse University. He worked as a staffer for former Syracuse area Congressman James Walsh and earned the title of Whiz Kid from the Syracuse newspapers for leading, at the age of 23, a computer-based efficiency initiative at Syracuse City Hall. He also served as executive director of the Onondaga County Democratic Committee. At Syracuse University, he was a university fellow at the Maxwell School of Citizenship and Public Affairs. In 2009, he was appointed to lead Delaware's Department of Natural Resources and Environmental Control. He became the National Wildlife Federation's president and CEO in 2014, overseeing America's largest wildlife conservation organization with 52 state and territorial affiliates and more than 6 million members and supporters. Founded in 1936, the organization is the nation's leading conservation group. From serving as captain of his high school baseball team to running for governor in Delaware in 2024, O'Mara's rise has been swift and sure, and he's showing no signs of slowing down anytime soon. Collin, welcome to The Voice.
Thanks, Fred. I'm thrilled to be here. Thanks for having me.
Full transparency. I started in June in a new role. I am the chair of the board of directors of the National Wildlife Federation. I've actually been on the board for 9 years. It's a voluntary position. For those of you listening who are UUP members, no, it's not affecting my so-called day job. Besides the fact that actually the reality is Collin and the staff do all the hard work. I just showed up for photo ops. But anyway, Collin, it's great to have you on. Really looking forward to this conversation. Going back to your early years in Syracuse, what would you point to that steered you in a direction of conservation work? Was it experiencing the outdoors with your family? What was it about that then also led you in a direction of an interest in politics? Because it's really both that come together in your career, especially now.
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, Syracuse is just a great place to grow up. In addition to the incredible seasons and everything, but you're 5 minutes from a city with all the attributes that the city offers, but you're also kind of around amazing nature and the Finger Lakes, and so growing up fishing and hunting and just being outdoors all the time. There's a story I tell, I think you've probably heard me tell many times about the Ranger Rick experience with the monarch butterflies and having my mom mail away for the packet of milkweed seeds and us planting them and seeing the plants come by. But I'll say that the experience that really, again, solidified my commitment to both the economy and the environment was the cleanup of Onondaga Lake. So when I was growing up, Onondaga Lake was the most polluted lake in the state and maybe the country by some measures. There's the big fight over, was Honeywell going to clean it up after they acquired the assets from the subsidiaries that had gone away. And being a kid with this huge lake that you're driving by all the time, you're going to the fair, you're going to the dome, you're going by whatever, you see it all the time, you can look, but you can't touch, right? Because it was so polluted. Flash forward a few years when I was working for Jim Walsh, one of his big goals was trying to have more federal funding to clean up the Superfund site element of it, kind of the public piece of it, and pushing on the companies. So a Republican doing that pushing, kind of a good environmental steward. Then I was working for a Democrat and Matt Driscoll when he was mayor. Also, the big fight then was in the cleanup plan. Was it going to be a series of wastewater treatment plants on the south side and in historically, underserved communities that were already facing big environmental justice issues? We didn't call it that at the time, but that's really what it was. And you had, the Republican county exec at the time basically saying, just keep all the pollution in the city, like don't have it spill into the neighborhoods. And so it was one of those fights where it's like, oh, like not only are we suffering from a legacy of jobs that had been gone for decades in that point, the pollution, but you had an asset that if you could revitalize, it'd be great for the ecosystem and great for, wildlife, but it also be great for the community. Yep. And so kind of being on the front end of that thing, it's now, a place with a beautiful lake trail. You can actually go fishing. I shouldn't eat too many of them still, but there's osprey overhead. There's bald eagles you'll see. It inspired on me what is possible by remediating some of our natural resources and got me hooked.
Yeah. And, you mentioned in your discussion about that cleanup, both parties engaged. And we all saw that, right? I mean, growing up, I actually grew up in a household where it tended more Republican. I grew up in Massachusetts, but it was a legacy of progressive, environmentally oriented Republicans. And in looking back, what was it that made it click whereby you could get both parties to agree that this was something necessary that needed to be done?
Yeah, I think it's there's kind of what I call it kind of a patriotism of place, right? Like regardless of party lines, like folks all cared about like the local natural resources. For the city, it was like, well, why do we have all these folks visiting Skaneateles or Kyoga on night or going up to Oswego, right, for the lake, and when they have a beautiful lake here that if we clean it up could be an amenity. Yeah. And so it wasn't partisan in a real way. And one of my favorite things was watching Matt Driscoll's work on fighting against the proposals to kind of decimate the city as part of the cleanup project, and then having Joni Mahoney make that a priority when she was running for county executive as a Republican. So all of a sudden you had this continuity for a greener strategy to clean it up instead of just a bricks and mortar kind of 1950s strategy. But it was focused on place and not based on party. And it was also just giving a vision for what could be instead of what always has been that folks could rally around. And I think, it's one of those great examples that taught me that if you can keep it focused on like the vision, right, and not like the partisan dialectic, you can all of a sudden kind of bring people together in a real way to get big things done. I mean, that was a $500 million cleanup, probably more than that now.
Yeah.
But everyone was all on board because there was a aspiration for what it could become, and not just a lake next to a mall.
And I have a suspicion, when you cut through, I mean, it's difficult today in today's world, but I think when you see what in the example that you gave, that even in today's climate, that kind of politics of place can still resonate and get through. And in our conversations, obviously in NWF, we've talked a lot about the coalitions we've built working with both parties on protecting public lands. Do you see a similar kind of echo in that in terms of a defensive place and the importance, specifically like on public lands? I know I lived in Montana for a while, and party doesn't matter. Those lands are vitally important for those of us who hike, who fish, who hunt, all of it. It's so vital to that place.
Yeah, I have a friend that was a former governor of Wyoming, and he tells a story about how, the hardest thing he had to do as governor was typically visiting the families of fallen soldiers from various overseas, conflicts in Afghanistan and Iraq during his tenure. And he said, he goes, to a person, there wasn't a single, example where they didn't bring out a picture of the soldier in nature, right, on public lands, enjoying the outdoors. And I think when it's built into our psyche like that, right, all of a sudden it isn't partisan. And so when somebody in the Senate proposes selling, multiple millions of acres of public lands, everyone immediately is gravitated to like the place they care about because it wasn't specific. And so a lot of places were at risk. And so all of a sudden folks that voted for different people for Senate or president or things like that were joining common cause. There was a rally in New Mexico, and it said, it's a great sign. And it said, tree huggers and rednecks united for public lands, right? Like,
yeah.
There's a similar thing in Missoula with the hippies and the gun toters. And so I'm really proud of the National Wildlife Federation's sportsman heritage because I do think that the sportsmen and women led the defense of our public lands. But it's because it was local. It wasn't about the president. It wasn't about party. It was basically saying, like, don't let these places be turned into development because once you lose them, they're gone forever. And I think when you have that, both a credible threat, it's not fear mongering. It was a realistic proposal to sell multiple millions of acres of land, and a visceral love. It's funny because some of our colleagues were like, "No, we need to talk about the hundreds of millions of acres that are at risk and this and that." It's like, no, we need to talk about the place where they shot their first elk, right? We need to take the place they caught their first cutthroat, and in having it be hyper local. So again, so it doesn't get caught up in the culture war. It doesn't get caught up in the wedges that are used to divide us often.
Exactly. I was just out in Buffalo for the Labor Day parade, and the usual route through Montezuma, right, which I just loved that drive. And every time I'm through there, it's like, I got to stop. In New York State, a lot of the focus is on the Adirondack Park, justifiably so. great step in preserving wildlands, Catskills. My impression, having lived now in New York State for, 40 years, it strikes me that there isn't as much of an awareness of the federal lands, like the wildlife refuges that are in New York State. Do you see that in some eastern states, there's more of I'll put it this way, an attachment to lands elsewhere, like in the West? People in the Northeast got to go out to Yellowstone, got to go out to Glacier and all that. Not as much awareness of the great lands that can be visited here, for instance, in New York State, that are federally preserved.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I think the work of Roosevelt and others, preserving the Adirondacks, and basically they got to conservation of public lands before the feds were kind of heavily involved, right? It's, so the Adirondack Park, precedes the refuge system, right? Precedes, most of the national parks in the country. Catskills, same thing. I think the state parks in New York are on par with a lot of national parks in other places just because the state protected them first. And in a lot of other places, they would have been federal. Obviously, in a state like New York that had more private land ownership than Western states had, there weren't as many opportunities. But Mountain Zoom is a good example. Like I was taking the kids to Seabreeze, a couple months ago, driving across from Syracuse towards Rochester. And we stopped just for a little bit, and we saw a nesting pair of bald eagles. And so I was like, hey, we'll just run over really quick. And there's some mergansers and shovelers and whatever. It's just the wetland complex is great. It was funny, though, because some other folks in the car with us, they had no idea that it was there, right? Yeah. They've driven on 90 1,000 times, right? And they had no idea that it was right there. So I think, one thing I'd like to talk about is how do we promote public lands more broadly? So it doesn't mean federal lands. It just means, publicly available spaces. Most of the lakes in New York, right, are public, right? Even though I think there's some shoreline issues in different places. When you think about the amazing experiences that are within, like I said, 15, 20 minutes of every major city in the 5 major cities upstate New York, or, in different places, like everyone's got nature close by. Yeah. Even New York City, right? Jamaica Bay is incredible. Yeah. You go out to the island. There's a bunch of places that are incredible. I think we could do a better job branding them. It's been such a federal fight because of ownership issues and sell off and all these kind of things, that I think folks take it for granted. But it's not just everything. I went to school up in New Hampshire, and the public lands, the mountains, like the presidential mountain peaks and all the stuff that we do with the mountain club, it's just spectacular. Again, it's folks talk about it a little differently, but it's still just it's to the benefit of all the people, as Roosevelt would have said.
Exactly, and it's something that obviously we can pass down, and like you're doing with your kids, I did the same with my sons, is introducing them to wild places, and even at early age to be able to talk about, maybe when they're 10, whatever, 11, start talking about the fact, this is the public's land. This belongs to everybody. And this is something that generations before us did, kind of to inculcate the idea that this is an obligation we have for those who come after us.
Well, one of my favorite stories is the Catskills, where you had the two competing visions. New York City saw it as a source of the fresh water drinking supply. Yep. Instead of building a bunch of treatment plants, they decided to protect the Catskills. The part of the story that not a lot of folks realize is that there was competing proposals for a ton of development in the Catskills to build a whole bunch of subdivisions for folks that were going to jet in down, 87 or whatever.
Yeah.
And that was the competing proposal. New York City actually got bid up in the pricing for the protection of that land because their developers want to develop it. Imagine New York State without the Catskills.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. Or having just tens of thousands of housing units all scattered throughout it, other places in the country. So these are these choices, and I think we take them for granted. Right. Exactly. It takes courage at the time. And I worked for a governor in Delaware that used to say, they're not going to remember our names, but they remember the places that we say, they remember the experiences that they had. I think that's the business we're in. We're in the experience business to make sure folks can have that connection to nature at a time when more and more folks are more disconnected from the natural world.
You mentioned your time in Delaware. You were, 29 when you became the head of the Delaware Department of Natural Resources and Environmental Control. A lot of words there. So what did the job entail? How did you get it? And God, you're 29. Maybe that's a good age to do because you figure, you know everything and you're going to solve all the problems. What was it like?
I was dumb enough to accept the job, right? That was not fully knowing what was in it. Delaware is a small state, has basically all the natural resource agencies in one group. Or in New York, you'd have DEC separate from NYSERDA, separate from, the parks and the Adirondack Commission, all that stuff. And so in Delaware, it's basically all of the EPA, all of the Department of Interior, all of the Department of Energy, all of the Army Corps, all of NOAA, all in one shop, which is fantastic. And it had been an agency that had faced some challenges. Delaware, for its small size, has, one of the bigger refineries on the East Coast. It's the largest chicken industry on the East Coast. You also have some of the most amazing tidal wetlands and some of the best beaches by far in the state. And so you kind of have all the challenges of like the East Coast industrial economies, as well as some of the rural challenges you might face in the South. And so regulating it is, and kind of managing it is, it's a challenge, because for the most part, a lot of the work in the past has been seen as zero sum. And so I'm working for the mayor of San Jose at the time. I was supposed to go to law school out in California, and decided driving across, a buddy of mine's father in Mishawaka, Indiana, said like, well, why do you want to be a lawyer? And I realized I didn't really want to be a lawyer. And so by the time I got to Stanford, I realized I didn't actually want to practice law. So I ended up working for the mayor of San Jose, who was just elected. And San Jose was fascinating because it was a place that had such a strong economic driver. Government's almost an afterthought. I mean, just like the economy is so strong. At the brink of like the kind of clean tech revolution, a lot of the innovations, especially in like solar and advanced renewables, happening at the same time. And so the mayor's challenge to me was trying to come up with strategies to take advantage of that, to make sure there's jobs created, kind of good paying jobs created in the area, not just the tech, not just the R&D jobs, but the actual production, manufacturing jobs. And then also use that as a way to build out the parks, build out, the cleaner air, cleaner water, more recycling, all the basics. And we built this thing called the Green Vision. The interesting thing is the mayor I worked for, a guy named Chuck Reed, was a decorated decorated Vietnam veteran. And he was a fighter pilot who hated to fly. And so he would get all these invitations to talk about the work that he was doing and didn't want to go. And so he would send me on all these different places. And I was like randomly in Tarrytown, New York, at the Rockefeller Estate, speaking about what we were doing in San Jose and some lessons for other cities. And there was somebody in the crowd that was was presenting on what Delaware was aspiring to do. It was close to this incoming governor, Governor Jack Markell. And then 4 months later, I get this random call in my office in San Jose saying, you wound up on this list because of some speech you gave. Do you want to come in and talk to us about it? And so that was the beginning of my experience in Delaware, which was quite the move, quite a difference from going from the heart of Silicon Valley to the great state of Delaware, the first state.
And having traveled a lot there, my son spent a lot of their growing years in Delaware. And I used to have to go downstate for the baseball tournaments and stuff. Delaware, and for, obviously a lot of our listeners probably don't realize this, it is an incredibly diverse state and so small. And yet the difference between the urban north and the wealthy suburbs, almost in a way connected to Philly. And then you head south and, you get down into southern Delaware. It's very rural. And it's agribusiness, the huge chicken production facilities. How did you manage the plethora of issues you had to address in your role, given the political differences, political culture, very different between North and South Delaware, and the diversity of issues such that Delaware could maintain a healthy environment for everybody?
Yeah, I mean, the nice thing is I worked for a governor who ran against the machine, ran against the system and won. And so he didn't owe a lot of people. And so that gave us the ability to actually be more innovative and not just kind of fall into the normal kind of zero sum approaches that I think, kind of have challenged the environmental movement in the past. I had an incredible deputy, guy named Dave Small, who was just brilliant, who just, I spent my first week there just traveling every inch of the state, every, all 120 miles of it, trying to really get to know everybody on the ground, every legislative district, every, Senate district, and really trying to see everything firsthand and begin to kind of process the talent. The other thing I did is I don't like bringing a ton of folks in from the outside. I think there's just incredible talent inside of organizations. And so I, inside Denver, I started asking around, like, who are the people go to fix things? When the secretary screws things up, when it's a bad budget decision, who's the fixer? Then I promoted all those people. I made all those people my division directors. And so all of a sudden I had the folks, and it sent a signal, right? That like folks that had experience in the agency were going to be listened to, they're going to have a real voice. Folks felt they had their champions in their work. And it was funny. I think the fear of me coming in so young was that kind of know-it-all, right? Like, I just listened, right? And 90% of the solutions to the biggest problems kind of vexing the state, our team had. No one was listening to them to actually implement them, or what they weren't resourced appropriately or whatever. And so I view my job as basically, surfacing the best solutions that they had and then resourcing them to make sure they can get done. And what we found is pretty quickly, we were able to reduce air pollution more than any other state in the country, percentage-wise, just by solutions that were already on the books, most of which the industry actually supported with a little bit of kind of partnership over how to make some switches to different fuels or different kinds of pollution controls. The work with agriculture, a lot of it was like technology improvements as opposed to just more heavy-handed regulations. Investing in the beaches and our resilience. So when Hurricane Sandy comes along 4 years later, we don't get decimated the way that Jersey did, right across the bay. And so it was just having trust in the expertise, right? And having trust in people and not assuming you know everything coming in, going to see it yourself. Don't allow yourself to be briefed on paper, like be briefed in the field, and just kind of having that, that just a more servant-minded, more humble leadership style where, it's funny because I think I was brought in for like all these new ideas. And like, I of course have plenty of ideas, But what I realized when I got there is just empowering others to actually implement the things that their expertise has led them to know for years, and actually having that the way we get big things done. And so, again, it wasn't perfect. I made plenty of mistakes, and most of the mistakes were me, when I injected my own 2 cents on things. But we were able to make progress because we listened.
Do you think, let me put it this way, was the interest in National Wildlife Federation in that position when it became open and you were going for it, was it a case where you wanted to move into the arena of NGOs and influence national policy, or was there a reach out to you given the success you had in Delaware? Well, it's because you're still young at that point. And no, you didn't come from a biologist background. So what was that dynamic like? Because, it's a big shift from, a policymaker to NGO.
Yeah, it's funny. I was like the kid that had like the 5-year plan in college. Like, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do this. And like, it all went to hell when I didn't go to law school. Right. And so, I had been asked to consider different positions like the Obama administration and some other state things. And none of them kind of felt quite right. And I really loved being in Delaware. And then I got a call out of the blue on the National Wildlife Federation job. And it's funny, I've been kind of National Wildlife Federation adjacent for my entire life, right? Going back to Ranger Rick, I did a ton of our state affiliates, and the affiliates in adjacent states were always some of my best partners on projects and things. And so I get this call out of the blue from Shelley Cohen, who was on the board at the time. And she had been doing, she does kind of renewable energy work and some things around energy efficiency. So I knew her kind of socially a little bit. But she's like, hey, it's like, I saw this picture of you, with sea turtles, doing a sea turtle rescue. And I was like, you're probably too young, but and you haven't really done the NGO thing, but would you be willing to have a conversation with the board about this position? And just completely out of the blue. And so the board had already gone through 98% of their process at that point. The great Bruce Wallace was leading the transition. And I kind of went in just trying to learn more. And it was funny. So I come in and I thought it was there for more of a discussion about the position. And it turns out it's a full blown interview. I got the murderer's row of 12 people. It was fascinating. Right. And I think, I love the Federation, kind of always have, but I'd never been, on the staff side. We have this conversation about the affiliates and the conversation about different things. The great Ken Salazar was really curious about affiliate relationships. And I was one of the few that actually knew the affiliates in all the different places just from my work in the region. Then one of the board members from Montana, was one of my favorites. I was like, this is all great, but he's never raised a dime, right? He's never done philanthropy. And the Federation was in a pretty big financial hole at the time. And so another friend of mine, the Montana, the Secretary of Natural Resources, or the Director of Environmental Quality, was able to allay her concerns. But no, it was completely serendipitous, right? It wasn't based on a strategy. It wasn't like a headhunter. It was literally a board member saw a picture and was like, oh, this kid could be interesting. Yeah. It's really outside the box for somebody that's not just of the DC bubble.
That's fascinating. So when you arrive, it's in the Obama years, and then Donald Trump is elected his first term, and then Biden serves his 4 years, and now we're into Trump. Some refer to it as a pendulum. It's almost worse than that in terms of these massive shifts. And at the same time, you're coming into a huge organization that has a great reputation across the political spectrum. What kind of adjustment was that for you right from the start in leading this massive organization? As you said, there were some financial challenges. But then as things go on, and like I said earlier, I joined the board in 2016, we're going through this whiplash of leadership. How do you steer that course just to maintain the stability of the organization? And I will testify to that. So our listeners can understand it, that organizations can get through these big swings in what's happening at the national leadership level. How did you experience it first when you were coming in, and then you have to deal with it?
The one thing that the board didn't share kind of fully was the state of the finances, just how deep the hole was. And that we were kind of rating our reserves as a way to, kind of keep the endowment as a way to keep the organization going. But I also just found incredible people, right? Just absolutely just incredibly talented folks. And I think there's a challenge in DC where it's easy to become just federal. I used to say that the National Wildlife Federation doesn't mean federal and kind of climate and then, kind of as an organization. It actually means nationwide, right? It gets to be in all 50 states and the territories and all the great work of at the regional level. It's got to still center wildlife, wildlife and people, right? It can be kind of equal measure, but there has to be a focus on wildlife because that's our unique niche. And that what makes us different is the federation. And so in some ways, it was kind of getting back to our roots to kind of prepare us for the future was the idea. And, I wanted to make sure that we were squarely focused on the wildlife, the biodiversity crisis, climate crisis, absolutely. But the climate crisis with solutions that aren't going to harm the natural world. There's such a push on technology that, if we're not careful, that we can put a lot more species even further at risk by just displacing one technology for another, and if ways that aren't cited well or kind of thought through. And then more focused on people, right? And now we focus, kind of talk very explicitly about environmental justice, but it was this focus on, making sure that communities that are just trying to make sure they can breathe clean air and breathe clean water have a place and a voice, of their own voice in the movement. And, I saw pretty quickly that our role, because of our history and also, kind of our approach to things, was as much being like the bridge between groups and trying to show how movements fit together to do big things, trying not to just be an appendage of like the Democratic Party, but really trying to show how these things are nonpartisan, or at least should be at a high level. And maybe not all the regulatory pieces, but anything investment-based, at least anything voluntary, should be nonpartisan. And really trying to show that there's a bigger whole that we're part of, right? Not part simply of like the sportsman groups, or simply the environmental justice groups, or simply the green groups, or simply the land trusts, but that all those groups actually have a ton in common in terms of the outcomes they want. They talk about it differently. The reasons they talk about it are different. But we also have a lot of overlap with other groups, other industry associations that they need access to clean water, or clean air, access to well-trained workforce, or tourism related to wildlife watching or hunting or fishing or something. And so we spend a lot of time trying to kind of distill what our role is. And I think that helped lead to a lot of fundraising opportunities, because it made us appeal to a broader swath of the population, and also to foundations. It allowed us to operate with almost equal effectiveness in Republican and Democratic administrations, while still calling balls and strikes fairly. When we disagree with something the Biden administration did, we said it. We don't. Same thing with the Trump administration. We tend not to make it as personal as maybe some other groups, even though there's a lot to get frustrated about. But I view our job as making progress every inch we can every day, regardless of the politics, regardless of the composition of the Congress or the state houses or whatever. The scientific imperatives demand that we do better every day. And I think having that as kind of an organizing principle, it just served us really well. And one of my former colleagues, one of my favorites, used to say, collaboration is our brand. And that, I just think, it's the old adage that's, overused, but, if you want to go far, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. We got to go far right now. The challenges are existential in a lot of ways, and we need bigger tents. Things that can transcend the partisan divides and the regional divides and the racial divides. And that, we've been ripped apart for decades now, and very much so in the last few years. And so we want to be one of the groups that can stitch people together to still do big things, because, God knows we need it.
Yeah. And as you talk about coalitions, obviously this is a union podcast, and you've been central in the Blue-Green Alliance and that work. And something that has also featured our national affiliate, American Federation of Teachers, AFT, led by Randy Weingarten. And I'm involved in that work, so I'm kind of in both worlds. Do you see progress in unions and conservation organizations or environmental organizations working together? I think there are some isolated moves where we can make common ground. So I would ask you, where do you see progress? Where do you still see stumbling blocks?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And look, I'm a union kid through and through, right? I wouldn't have been able to go afford college if my mom was a member of the teachers union, and when she was a public school teacher. And my dad actually was with UA for a little while before he went into the military. I come from Irish, right? So I got cops and firefighters, FOP, and everything else. I through the ranks. I got IBW cousins and all that kind of stuff. For me, the movements actually fit together beautifully. And because the same conditions for worker safety inside of the steel workers organized facility, for health and toxics are the same. Pollutants are going to affect, the big critters outside and the folks that hunt and fish them. And so there was a great vision by Leo Gerard, who was the longtime head of the steelworkers, to bring this together with Carl Pope, who was the head of the Sierra Club at the time. And the goal was to focus on the things you agree on, right? And so, when I think about the House of Labor, obviously a lot of alignment with the teachers, a lot of alignment with SEIU and service workers, a lot of alignment with ASME. But where I get most excited is the work with the building trade stuff, because I just think we have to rebuild the country. We can put a ton of folks at work. We got to rebuild the energy system. We got to build out transmission. We got to transform the transportation system, and hopefully do it all in a way that enhances wildlife populations and not diminishes them. But those are the tough conversations, right? And I think, I tend to be more of a technology optimist, where I want to push the guards of, what we can get for cleaner energy, but also for pollution controls and, everything else. There's a ton of work in that. I'd love all those projects to be PLAs and make sure that everyone's working under the best possible working conditions, and, robust apprenticeship programs, and really be thoughtful about responsible contracting and all the different ways to do it right. But as someone who has got lifted into the middle class by unions, if we can also lift up the country and make our country more resilient and make our country have cleaner energy and all these additional benefits, it's just a win-win. And so when there's a leadership change in the Sierra Club and the Blue-Green Alliance was looking for a new co-chair, I was actually flattered that the steelworkers suggested that I be the guy. But it's a fascinating space to have these conversations that you don't have in many places, right? Like folks just end up kind of, they have their corner, fight the other corner, and it's kind of zero sum. Somebody wins, somebody loses. Where what we saw in like the Inflation Reduction Act and the bipartisan infrastructure bill is working really closely with like with NAB2, the North American Building Trades Unions, and all the member companies. We were able to make great strides, right, on climate and infrastructure simultaneously, right, on energy and on reducing pollution simultaneously. Still a lot of work to do. We're doing it right now on permitting, trying to figure out smart ways to improve our permitting system, because it's just, we can't get good things done either. Like it's just we've kind of created a block to be able to move things. And at the same time, make sure communities have input, making sure we're not destroying habitat in the process and all the other things. But I'm really optimistic. And I think there's obviously, fights that occur over pipelines and different things. I'd rather have a new updated pipeline in many cases that's going to be safer than an old one that could rupture. But I'm not quite as far to the left as some of my colleagues and organizations that are trying to stop things all the time. But at the end of the day, I still feel like, we're stronger together. And, I think when the labor movement, the conservation movement, and, EJ movement and sportsmen and all those, they're saying the same thing. You can move mountains regardless of what the politics of the day are.
Yeah, and I think we have a connection to the building trades, mostly through staff connections with some folks who used to work here and work down there, and are doing a lot of great programs in high schools and in colleges, and hooked up with the apprenticeship programs. And a thought that just occurred to me as you were talking, because one of the central roles that National Wildlife has seen as part of its mission is education. And obviously, we're a union of educators and healthcare workers and so forth. But do you see a role where in, say, for instance, apprenticeship programs, could there be a role for an organization like NWF to work with institutions, with unions, and to say, okay, as we're doing these apprenticeship programs, we're also going to talk about, yes, the way we can develop the greenest technology possible, the need for obviously labor, and we know about that, while at the same time it's connected to those places where those individuals in the apprenticeship programs might want to take their families to hike, might want to go boating, might want to hunt, might want to fish. Do you see that as a potential?
Yes, absolutely. And we're doing some of it already. So, it's estimated that at least 75% of folks in the building trades and manufacturing trades either have hunting or fishing licenses. Right. The overlap is just massive, and folks that just enjoy the outdoors on the weekend after working hard all week. And so, yes, I think there's also, we've been working with some of the pathway to apprenticeship type programs and the LEAP type programs, trying to get folks ready for apprenticeships. That kind of pre-work to get them, kind of in the queue. One of the things that we're finding is that a lot of apprenticeship programs or pre-apprenticeship programs want to have their members know like what they're building for, right? Like, so understand the energy system a little more, understand different types of technology, understand the types of jobs that are going to be available, especially as they're making the decision, like, do I want to join UA or do I want to join IBW or do I want to join the ironworkers or the Boilermakers? Kind of thinking through the different opportunities. And then by having PLAs on some of the projects, right, we guarantee that pipeline of actual work, no pun intended. So I think it's beyond just nature. I think it's actually, helping folks know the opportunities that exist, giving some additional opportunities. Kim Martinez, who does a phenomenal job with our education programming, it's not just K-12 anymore, right? It's kind of K through your lifetime. Yep. And not just focusing on the kids who are in college and all the green campuses and all that kind of stuff, which is great, but also folks that are ready for the workforce and ready to kind of get into those programs and giving them a way to both have a great salary and good benefits and great training and do some good at the same time. And that's a pretty good value proposition for a lot of folks right now, and better than having a ton of debt for some folks. So
yeah, exactly. One of our institutions that you know well, where we represent, is College of Environmental Sciences and Forestry. And we do have some concerns because some programs are being eliminated. It's an institution that just, they turn students away because, especially today, there is such an interest in ESF and the programs there. Where do you feel higher education in an institution like ESF, what kind of role does it play going forward as we face what in NWF is referred to as those three areas of concern, the two crises, the biodiversity crisis, the climate crisis, and then issues around environmental justice? Where do institutions of higher ed, what role can we continue to play, hopefully, going forward?
Yeah, you're going to be fired up on this one because I sort of revere ESF. Yeah. I think it's the best public school, environmental program in the country, and not put on par with anybody. It's absolutely bar none. And when I was up at the Maxwell School in my fellowship there, I did a bunch of classes that were across the list of the ESF with some of the great faculty there. It's where you prepare the leaders of tomorrow, right? And I think the thing that's interesting about ESF is that, especially given its intersection with like Maxwell, the Maxwell School of Syracuse, is that you teach folks not just the foundational science, but how to apply it and how to actually create change. Yeah. And I think that's like one of the biggest weaknesses we have right now as a movement is that The economists speak a foreign language. The policy folks are so kind of insider speak. It's hard. The scientists can't talk to anybody. And there's a lack of folks that can translate across disciplines. The thing that ESF does better than anybody else is kind of, it explains the why, not just the how, right? So all of a sudden you're taking an environmental economics class, one class, and then connects to why the energy system incentives are creating these Pagovian externalities, right? And kind of the role of kind of how different market signals or not kind of dictate, certain decisions. Like you come out with a more well-rounded view of how to affect change in a real way. It makes you more dynamic, right? That's why everybody that graduates from ESF gets snatched up immediately because they're so valuable compared to other places. And I was in Arizona recently with Michael Crow as the great president of ASU. Obviously a very controversial figure. But one of the things that he said, he goes, I don't want 7,000 kids to get a great education. I want 70,000 kids to get a great education so I can change the world. Yeah. And it actually kind of put and someone who went to Dartmouth and Oxford and these different kind of fancy places, it actually was kind of a light bulb where it's like, if we have a great institution, let's move as many folks through as possible, having the staff support and the professional ranks to support that. But it's like, why wouldn't we want, as many kids coming through in this moment in particular, given the crises that we're facing, that have that, kind of a unique ability. And yes, there's a prestige factor, having smaller classes and all that kind of thing. But like, we need leaders from ESF in every agency in state government and every agency in federal government. And so the idea of contracting right now, especially as the state's trying to argue that they're a leader on kind of climate action and given some of the other things that have happened last few years, you can't win the future unless you have the talent to actually be there to meet the moment in the future. Right now, and we're seeing this across the board, right? We're seeing the disinvestment in public institutions, across the country. I mean, it's not specific to New York, but of all the areas to disinvest and not invest in the folks that are going to help solve the climate crisis and the biodiversity crisis in this moment and also create the jobs and the opportunities of the future is just absolutely ludicrous. And
you make an excellent point. A lot of them there, but one is that the attacks on the public sector, a lot of focus on the present administration in D.C., but the attacks on the public sector go way back. In our experience in New York, it wasn't a Republican. It was Andrew Cuomo. And you can go back and make the argument it was Mario Cuomo where this thing got started in terms of attacking the public sector. It's nonpartisan, but what we have to do is get back to the idea that the public sector is crucial for the well-being of our society. We're up against the clock, but I wanted to give you a chance. You're a hopeful guy, I have to admit, and you've heard me say this in our meetings, that I have a tough time sometimes staying hopeful. What do you say to our audience as to what fuels your hope for the future, given the crises that we're facing?
Yeah, I mean, Fred, as you know, I'm a girl dad, right? I got little ones. I got a 2-year-old, an 8-year-old, and a 13-year-old. We have no choice but to succeed. I mean, like the apocalyptic alternative is just like unthinkable. And so that's what keeps me up. And I've also seen folks that disagree on everything come together on things. And there's a story I often tell about Jim Inhofe, who was a senator from Oklahoma, who's one of the biggest climate skeptics probably to ever serve in the U.S. Senate. And when the chips were down late in the congressional session, we were trying to help the city of Flint get some funding to replace the lead pipes. And we had this meeting, and the mayor kind of spoke eloquently and made the case beautifully about why they needed it, and she talked about the impact of lead on kids' brains and the whole thing. And the senator said, "I'll do it." And there was this kind of hesitation. She's kind of like, "You'll do what?" And he's like, "They're all God's children. So it's my kids. I wouldn't want their brains to be polluted. So we'll find the money." And it's somebody that most of the environmental community had just ridiculed for years, right, for being on the wrong side of things. But in that moment, there was a humanity that came through, right? They're basically saying, no kid should have to drink dirty water and have their brain, contaminated. I mean, I've seen the same thing with like mercury pollution. Again, these episodic moments, but they give me hope that they're still good, right? That can be done and can bring people together. And we're in it right now, right? I mean, the attacks on offshore wind, the different kind of attacks on climate foundation, climate science. But at the same time, there's communities across the country that are saying, like, look, we were ravaged by this hurricane last year, or this forest fire got so much worse, or I don't want my public land sold. I mean, so we're beginning to transcend politics. These folks are seeing the consequences of inaction, or insufficient action is probably the way I should put it. And that's what gives me hope, because I do think that what breaks us out of this kind of current us-them kind of division of the country is getting back to like what folks care about, right? Their family, their community, the patriotism place that I mentioned, this idea of like the love they have for their community. And if we can win those conversations, you can still move mountains. And we're seeing different places. Like we were able to save a bunch of money in the reconciliation package for, agriculture, right? For conservation of wildlife on private lands. I mean, the public lands fight was a big public fight. And again, it's not enough to overcome some of the bad things that we're seeing, but it's laying a foundation for the big things when those opportunities present themselves. And I think one of the big lessons for me for the last few years is that a lot of the environmental movement's focus has historically been on Democrats. And understandably, the Democrats have been great allies on things, but it's kind of, as a Syracuse fan, right? You live by the three, you die by the three. There's a challenge when you put all your eggs in that basket, and then there is the trifecta Republican control like we're seeing now. A lot of it gets torn down pretty fastly, and probably pretty fastly. And so one of the things that I'm focused on is that durability. And so how do you use those glimmers of hope to build a durability that actually allows us to make sure that it's not just the whipsaw? I agree, it's not a pendulum. It's swinging too fast for a pendulum. It's like a sword of Damocles or something coming at us. It's to make sure that we're not in the crosshairs for that all the time, because there's enough support on both sides where folks are like, hey, just leave that alone. And we saw the public lands, right? A couple folks were like selling it. And I was like, no, that's not a rail we want to touch. So, we don't make that the third rail. That's what gives me hope. And so I encourage all your members, it's just, don't give up on anybody, right? Like, we got to convince folks, and it's hard. It's organizing. It's down face. Well, I know where we started. It's basic organizing on the ground, block by block, still talking to folks, because, we can't write off half the country if we want to make progress for all the country.
Yeah, it's a great way of closing our conversation. And I think it relates to our work, where when we fight to save a program or save a campus, or, last year with the fight at Downstate to save a hospital, it's about the communities and the progress we can make in those communities that can make a huge difference in the lives of people and move us forward. Collin, it's been a pleasure. Enjoyed it very much. And thanks for joining us and sharing your wisdom and experience.
Thanks for having me, and thanks for all your members do. Good stuff. Let's say VSF.
Yes, absolutely.
Very good. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.
Welcome to Labor Look Back, where we take a look back at labor's storied past. From strikes and uprisings to dynamic union leaders and huge union wins, we'll cover it all. Here's a look back at labor history from the month of September. From strike-breaking thugs wielding bats to battalions of armed lawmen, brave union workers, especially those in the early 20th century, routinely put their lives on the line for basic job safety protections and fair wages. Such was the case in late August and early September of 1921, when some 10,000 armed West Virginia Union coal miners squared off against 3,000 police, company-hired ruffians, and anti-union vigilantes dubbed the Logan Defenders in what is now known as the Battle of Blair Mountain. Part of the Coal Wars, the Battle of Blair Mountain is one of the largest union uprisings in American history. Things got ugly quickly. Nearly 1 million rounds of ammunition were fired during the week-long standoff, which took place in Logan County, West Virginia. U.S. President Warren G. Harding called in the West Virginia National Guard on September 2nd, and the confrontation came to an end 2 days later. But not before Don Chafin, the notoriously anti-union Logan County sheriff, decided to drop bombs on the workers. Literally decided to drop bombs on them. Chafin recruited private pilots who used their planes to drop as many as 4 homemade explosive and gas bombs on the miners. No one was killed by the bombs, which were filled with nuts, bolts, and shrapnel, and leftover World War I gas shells. It marked the first time in U.S. history that American citizens were bombed on U.S. soil by private aircraft. As for Chafin, he was roundly hated by Union miners. "We'll hang Don Chafin from a sour apple tree" was a popular miners' song back then. When the federal troops arrived, the miners quickly gave up their guns and surrendered. Many of them were veterans, and they refused to fight against the government. Nearly 1,000 miners were indicted for murder and treason, but most were acquitted by sympathetic juries. The clash and bombing illustrated the power and brutality used by coal companies and their supporters to put down unions in the early 20th century. It also brought national attention to the horrible working and living conditions of miners and the acute need for change.
At the Battle of Blair Mountain.
We leave our homes in the morning. We kiss our children goodbye.
Ella Mae Wiggins worked as a spinner at American Mill No. 1 in Bessemer City, North Carolina in 1929. Her life was hard. By age 29, she had given birth to 9 children and lost 4 of them to malnutrition and disease. Her husband, an alcoholic, deserted Wiggins and her kids in 1926, leaving them to live on wages of $9 a week, which was earned by Wiggins. But she believed in the power of being in a union and in the power of music. A talented singer and songwriter, Wiggins wrote about the difficulties of being a single working mom in songs like The Big Fat Boss and the Workers, Two Little Strikers, and The Mill Mother's Lament. Folk legends Woody Guthrie and Pete Seeger performed her songs, and Seeger recorded The Mill Mother's Lament. When nearly 2,000 workers at the Lorry Mill in Gastonia, North Carolina went on strike in April 1929, Wiggins joined the National Textile Workers Union, which represented the striking workers, and she joined them. Convinced that being in a union was the only way to make a better life for herself and her children, Wiggins spoke at rallies and joined picket lines. A few weeks after the strike began, most mill workers, harassed by the mill owners and their hired mill thugs, went back to work. But about 300 workers, including Wiggins, set up on the outskirts of town, picketing and holding union rallies. Police raided the camp in June 1929. The town police chief was killed in the altercation. Wiggins further infuriated the town's elite by encouraging black labor leaders to join the strike. On September 14th, a truck Wiggins was riding in to a union rally was ambushed. Pregnant at the time, she was shot in the chest and was killed. No one else on the truck was shot, leaving many to believe the ambush was actually an assassination. 5 men were charged with Wiggins' murder. More than 50 eyewitnesses testified against the men, but the jury found them not guilty after deliberating for just 30 minutes. On the 50th anniversary of her death in 1979, the local chapter of the National Organization for Women erected a marble cross on her unmarked gravesite. The cross read, "She was killed carrying the torch of social justice, September 14th, 1929. For UUP Look Back, I'm Mike Lisi. And now here's Fred with Cole's Coda.
Thanks, Mike. Well, hopefully you enjoyed today's interview with Collin O'Mara from National Wildlife Federation. To close, I would like to talk about a subject that's very close to my heart, and that is history. By training, I'm a political scientist. That's what my PhD is in. But when I was in graduate school, originally I went for a master's in economics and actually focused on economic history. And it's in part because of a lifelong infatuation with history. I love to read. I love to study it beyond just the stories of people, the motivations, what we all can learn. There once was something I read about biographies of M.L. King and the way he has been treated in history far too often as this prophetic and immortal, some would say, perfect person. And this writer was talking about how, in fact, he was flawed. And as a fuller story of Martin Luther King comes out, the case he was making is it's important for us as human beings to know that the people we admire, the people that we seek to emulate in terms of their public lives, may have very, very flawed personal lives. But in fact, all of us are flawed. It's good to know that we don't have to believe that our heroes are so unique that we could never be like them. No, we do have that capability. We really do. And that's what makes history important. Just read another. I've read so many biographies of Abraham Lincoln. What amazes me about him was his understanding of his own flaws and failings. He was just such a humble man. And that's perhaps why he was so specially gifted to deal with the crisis of the Civil War. Along the same lines, it is deeply troubling to me that the efforts being undertaken by the regime in D.C. to, I guess the word is sanitize American history, how dangerous that is on a number of scores. One is to paint the picture that our country has never made mistakes, that only America is perfect and the rest of the world is flawed. That's unrealistic, but it is also deeply, deeply dangerous because in doing so, it erases the struggles that all Americans have endured to a certain extent. And to know that history of struggle, it is imperative to know what people have gone through in this country to make it better, to make it more in line with the principles articulated in the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator to certain unalienable rights, among these life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And yes, I did say men. I used the original wording because in those days, for Thomas Jefferson and for the rebels, American rebels, to say that all men were equal was considered insane because the general perspective was men are not equal. There are those who are wealthier, more endowed with property, and thus better. Never occurred to them to consider gender, not yet, although Abigail Adams made sure that her husband, John Adams, was aware of the necessity for gender equality as well. Now, what's all this leading to? It's all leading to one of the most phenomenal books I've read over the past couple years, written by Pulitzer Prize winner David Zucchino. It's called Wilmington's Lie. It's about the murderous coup of 1898 and the rise of white supremacy in North Carolina, in Wilmington, North Carolina. It is a staggeringly disturbing book because of its echoes to January 6th. When you bookend the two events about how white supremacists, conservatives, those seeking to put back in place white dominance in the South years after the Civil War. Now, these efforts went on for years after the Civil War. But in Wilmington, it led to an explosion of intense violence and murder against black folks in Wilmington, driving many out of the city forever, and then also targeting those political leaders who had the courage to believe in a multiracial, biracial republic, fully democratic, based on the principles of the Declaration of Independence. The story has been was buried for so long. It is still something that North Carolinians wrestle with, as apparently all Americans do. I recommend this book strongly because it shows what could have happened on January 6th in terms of a mob armed overthrow of a government. The disturbing thing is that though January 6th failed, the perpetrators of that riot and insurrection are now empowered, and those who are not have been pardoned, and those who pursued them, prosecutors in the Department of Justice, have been fired. Read Wilmington's Lie to see what can happen in a society when the voices of violence triumph over those of equality and what it can lead to, because I fear that that may be where our nation is going if we are not vigilant. Good night and good luck.
When it's time to speak truth, the power, my friend, join a union, you understand.
The Voice Podcast is a production of United University Professions. You can find UUP on Facebook, Instagram, X, and Blue Sky at UUP Info. UUP is on the web at uupinfo.org. This episode was produced by Mike Lisi, Communications Director for UUP. UUP Director of Administration Lynn Alderman is Associate Producer. The host of The Voice is UUP President Fred Kowal. You can download the Voice Podcast theme for free by going to uniteduniversityprofessions.bandcamp.com. Thanks for listening.